Hello. Today we will begin talking about complex sentences, but before we look into the book, I'd like us to look at these 5 examples. Because I like purple, even though she didn't know how to do it. Since I was a child. When I go to the store, if I get an 85% in all of my courses. Are these complete sentences? I want you to think about it. Let's look at number 1. Is this a complete sentence because I like purple? I hope that you can feel and know that this is not a complete sentence. Why is it not a complete sentence? Well, in the meaning, the meaning is not finished. Because you like purple, what? You can feel that we're kind of waiting for the rest of the sentence, and the same with all of the others. Now let's take a look at some other similar examples. On the other part of the page, in this part, we have the same underlined sections, but let's look at the sentence. I bought the purple socks because I like purple. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, that is a complete sentence. She tried to skateboard even though she didn't know how to do it. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, that is a complete sentence. I have been practicing piano since I was a child. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, that is a complete sentence. When I go to the store, I am always tempted to buy sweets. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, that is a complete sentence. If I get an 85% in all of my courses, I will move on to the accelerated program. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, that is a complete sentence. So we can see in these examples that all of these are complete sentences. They have the same piece, but it's only one piece of the sentence. We can also see that there's a subject and verb, and there is also another subject and verb. That's because we have 2 different parts in this sentence. We have what is called the main clause with the main idea. I bought the purple socks. She tried to skateboard. I have been practicing piano. I am always tempted to buy sweets. I will move on to the accelerated program. These are complete sentences. And this other part is called a dependent clause, or some books call it a subordinated clause, or we can call it a dependent. Dependent clauses are the ones that are not complete on their own. For example, because I like purple is incomplete. If we delete this part, I bought the purple socks, this is a complete thought. It can be independent. But because I like purple is incomplete. It's dependent. It's waiting for a main idea to help complete the idea. So again, the independent clause, the main clause, is a sentence that can be alone. When we add this word or these keywords, oops, this part I forgot to underline. When we add these keywords, it makes the second part, or it could be the first part, it makes this other clause, this other subject verb, a dependent clause. And therefore, it cannot be alone in a sentence. It is not a sentence by itself. It must be with a main clause. That's why many books call it dependent, because it depends on something else. It needs something else. So moving into our grammar book, we're going to look in Grammar and Beyond, book 4. It's the purple book. And we are looking at page 8. Page 8 in Grammar and Beyond, book 4. The grammar presentation says, another way to link cause and effect ideas is with complex sentences. Complex sentences have one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. If we look at the example, we see, because resources are readily accessible in developed countries like the United States, People in these countries tend to have large ecological footprints. Again, if we cover up this other part, the first part with the because resources are readily accessible in developed countries like the United States, this is an incomplete thought. We are waiting for the rest of the sentence. This cannot be a sentence alone. This part, resources are, can be a sentence alone, but when we have this word, this clause word, it creates a dependent clause and it must be connected to a main clause. Part 3.1. A complex sentence has an independent clause and a dependent clause introduced by a subordinator. That's the name of this word, these words in bold, like because, even though, although. Subordinators show the relationship between two ideas. We have already discussed conjunctions that connect two sentences. We have also discussed transition words that connect two ideas, and this is another way to connect two sentences. We have words that have meaning, and we can connect them. The important thing to know about this grammar is that it follows some different punctuation rules than the conjunctions and the transition words. So again, this is part vocabulary. You must understand the meaning of the word to show the correct type of relationship, and you must also know how to use the word. That's how to use the correct punctuation and how to put it in the sentence, where it should be located and what it comes with. When the dependent clause comes first, use a comma to separate it from the independent clause. We can see that in this example. Although the people try to save energy, comma, global demand for energy increases every year. This part, although people try to save energy, is the dependent clause because it is not complete. It is not a complete thought alone. However, because it is first in the sentence, we must put a comma after it. We put a comma after the entire clause, after we finish the subject, verb, and object if we need an object. And then we put the main clause. If we look at the example above, future generations will suffer if the pollution is not reduced. In this case, we have our independent clause first, and then we have our dependent clause. And therefore, we do not need a comma because we have this keyword that signals the dependent clause. We do not need a comma. We actually cannot use a comma if the dependent clause is second in the sentence. If it is first in the sentence, we must include this comma before we have our next subject-verb combination. Part 3.2 says, in academic writing, use complex sentences with subordinators because, if, and when to express cause and effect relationships. We can use because. We can use if we want to set up a hypothetical situation. Since has the same meaning as because. Since can also mean time. So be careful with this one. And when, we'll set up a time relationship, but we can also talk about some effects when a situation happens. A dependent clause that is not connected to an independent clause is a fragment. We talked about fragments earlier in this chapter when it was missing a subject or a verb or an object. Also, if you have a dependent clause without your main clause or your independent clause, then it is also a fragment. As we said, we are waiting for the rest of the sentence. Like in our example, because I like purple. It's a fragment because the idea is incomplete without your main clause. Avoid dependent clause fragments in the following ways. Number 1, connect the dependent clause to an independent clause. Or change the subordinator to a transition word that can introduce an independent clause. So you have 2 two different ways that you can correct your mistake if you have a fragment. You can either use the correct punctuation, or you can change your word to make it into a transition word, which can be in a sentence alone. Let's look at our fragment example. Because energy use is high in the developed world, this is the fragment right here. This is not a complete sentence. Here we have people there use a lot of resources. This is a common problem that many ESL students have, English learners, because they confuse the period with the comma. This sentence is incomplete. This is a fragment sentence. However, we could make it a complete sentence by changing the punctuation. Because energy use is high in the developed world, comma, people there use a lot of resources. Let's imagine this same example. If this is first and this is second, do we need a comma? No, we cannot use a comma when the dependent clause comes second. Most students have a problem where they confuse their punctuation. Because is a dependent clause. It must have a comma if it is first in the sentence. It cannot be a sentence alone. If it comes second in the sentence, there is no comma. Or the other option is to change the subordinator into a transition word. Energy use is high in the developed world, period. As a result, comma, people there use a lot of resources. So we removed this word and we put in a result transition word. We have already talked about transition words and the punctuation that they take, the period before, the transition, the comma. So those are two possible ways that you can correct this type of mistake. For your homework tonight, please look in your book and please do exercise 3.1, complex sentences. It says for each pair of sentences about bald eagles, write C next to the sentence that shows the cause and E next to the sentence that shows the effect. Next, combine the sentences using because, if, since, or when. Sometimes more than one answer is possible. So remember, because shows our reason or the cause. If shows a possible situation. Since also means the same as because, it shows cause. Since can also mean time sometimes. And when usually means time, but we can use it in a cause and effect situation if we want to talk about some effect of a situation in time. For example, when I go to the store, I am always tempted to buy candy. All right, they have the example here. We've got the effect. We identified the cause. And then there is a whole sentence. You can write your sentence with the dependent clause first or the dependent clause second. Please try using a variety, but remember, if your dependent clause comes first, you must have this comma, not a period. It must be a comma. So it is